Hi everyone, now let's start talking about instrumentation with a focus on the instruments and your research. Defining research instruments. Your instruments include what you and your research team will use to collect data and the protocol or instructions the researchers will follow when they implement the instruments. Instruments include things like surveys, questionnaires, interview questions, IQ tests and aptitude tests, personality tests, observation checklists, case study or focus group questions, and implementation instructions, field note plans and instructions, scientific equipment like scales, thermometers, and experimental protocol documents. These are all your instruments, and of course the protocol documents go with your instruments. Instruments in your proposal. Proposals must include the instruments to be used in your research, as well as detailed descriptions of how they are to be implemented. Remember, this is a recipe, or you can think of it as a blueprint, or a gameplay in a game. You have the tool, which is the instrument, and the protocol or instructions to use that. Instruments can exist, or may be something you create. If they're out there being used, and they make sense in your research, then you would just provide the instrument that's already being used because you intend to use that. Maybe you're using a combination of instruments that exist and also instruments that you create. Your proposal will include a section on instruments in Chapter 3 after your sampling section. Explain your instruments briefly. If they've been used in other research, discuss where and how they've been used and issues of reliability and validity. Obviously, if you're creating them yourselves, you will explain if you're going to pilot them so that you can benefit the reliability and the validity, but you would talk about that being one of the limitations. And if you're doing both, you would explain both. But in Chapter 3, it's a description of each instrument briefly because you're going to attach them. You will include the instruments themselves and the protocol to follow in using the instruments as appendices. Pretend you will not be the researcher when you create your instruments or plan for your instruments to be implemented. What's the goal? A person unfamiliar with your research can read your instrument section and your appendices that go with the instruments and know what to do to carry out your proposed research. Ask a friend how they'd follow your recipe. If they can't do it, ask what detail they need to get it. Then edit and repeat until you've got it right. Surveys, demographics, and levels of measurement. Many of you will create surveys or collect demographic data, so I'm going to focus a bit here on creating those kinds of instruments. These are not the only kinds of instruments. I'm not encouraging you or discouraging you to create them. I'm just using the most common example to help you understand instrument development. How do you create a good survey? Well, we can collect nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio data. These are referred to as levels of measurement. As you're searching, you may want to search levels of measurement and spend a little bit more time studying what this means. Nominal is the lowest or simple level of data, and ratio is the highest level, allowing for the most detail to be collected. Nominal is based on things like labels, male versus female if you ask sex, yes versus no if it's a yes or no question. Ordinal data expresses order or rank. So it's a label, but it's ranking. So strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly agree. Or prefer, strongly prefer, prefer, unsure, do not prefer, etc. Interval data can express the distance between data points, like a heart rate of 65 or a heart rate of 92 beats per minute. One can tell how different one is from the other. With strongly agree and agree, we can't really tell how different one is from the other. Someone may have been on the edge. But 65 and 92 is considered a high heart rate. 65 is considered a moderate or lower heart rate. There's a lot in between. We could have picked 68 and 90, and we still would have the same labels in terms of categories. But it wouldn't tell us as much about how moderate or low or how high something is. So if you can collect it at this level, that's better. But knowing how much someone agrees is probably not something that you can collect as easily in an interval way. Ratio data can measure an absolute zero, so nothing up until this point can be measured at an absolute zero. It is mathematically finite. If you intend to count how many times something occurs in an experiment or an observation, ratio data will be gathered. You can also gather information on how many dollars something costs in terms of income, different things like that. So you try to collect at the highest level possible. We'll talk a little bit more about why. The higher the better. We can report down from the higher levels, but we cannot report up from the lower levels. For example, male and female as nominal or an ordinal. If you ask the question sex, you're asking male or female. If you ask the question gender and you only give them the option of male or female, you do not have the opportunity to assess what gender people are more likely to identify with. Interestingly, when we create a scale for gender that has 1 through 10, and you put male at one end and female at the other, and you ask people to place where they see themselves as in terms of which gender they identify with, while there would be some people who place themselves in the middle, most who would have selected male or female will not pick the 1 or the 10 in the most extreme ends. In fact, many of us engage in activities that are of the gender that is opposite to our sex, or are told or are perceived as being more masculine or more feminine than others. So you would see a range in terms of gender. In fact, it's not appropriate to ask if someone is male or female when you're asking gender, because gender has gray area. It is only appropriate to ask it when you're asking sex. Another example, household income. If you asked it in terms of nominal data, the most you could say is, which best describes your household income situation? High income or low income? That's as good as it gets with nominal data. Most of us would probably know not to do that, and maybe in some studies that would be enough. But if you ask at any of the higher levels, you can always boil it down to high and low if your reporting calls for that. Ordinal data in terms of income. Which best represents your annual household income, you might ask? And then you would give them these options. 0 to 10,000 annually, 11 to 25,000, 26 to 49,000, 50 to 99,000, and 100,000 above. Now they have options like the strongly agree, disagree, and strongly disagree, and they definitely rate from one to the other, their ranking. This is ordinal data. This gives you more detail than high and low income. You could still decide later to collapse these, when they answer these questions, into high and low income if it makes sense. But with high and low income data, you can never move up and express things in an ordinal data way. Interval data and the same household income type of question. Which best represents your annual household income, you would ask? And then you would give the options of 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, all the way up to 100,000. In each of these instances, you may choose different amounts. Maybe you start at 10,000. Maybe you go all the way up to $1 million. The point is you have a regular incremental change and someone can see the amount between. So you may say, which best describes where you are? It's not an exact amount. A family may make $62,000 a year, so they would select 60. They may make $81,000 a year, so they'd select 80. They might make $98,000 a year, so they'd select 100. So you could at least get a range between what they selected and another. Ratio data, though, whenever possible, is the best way to get household income. In order to do that, you would have to ask, please indicate your annual gross household income, and leave a blank and have them fill in that blank. Now, I will say that as you're doing research and going into the space of household income, people oftentimes do not like to specify how much they make, and they will typically underreport if they are upper class, overreport if they're lower income, and within the middle it varies depending on how they perceive themselves. So oftentimes, even though we know it's better to ask the income question in terms of ratio data, we will instead break it down into different interval sections or even ordinal amounts that we feel comfortable are detailed enough for our purposes. But whenever humanly possible, the ratio data is going to give you the best, most accurate data, especially when it comes to household income. The most accurate description can be found at the higher level, even if you choose not to report at that level. So always ask yourself when you ask a question, can I ask it at a higher level? If you've asked it ordinally, ask if you can ask it in interval, because you can always report it back in an ordinal or nominal way, but you can never get more detailed after you've asked the questions. Question order also matters. The order in which you ask the questions can be very important. Mix it up and avoid neutral options. There are 3 things I'd like you to keep in mind when coming to question order. Respondents want to finish fast. We all know this. We've responded to surveys before. Oftentimes we'll only do it if it says it will only take 3 to 5 or 5 to 10 minutes of your time. If you ask questions with the same scale, they may just quickly check the boxes on one side to get through it. So one of the things that you can do to increase validity of your responses is to move the options around. So on one question, you may start with strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and on the next one, move it around so that the strongly disagree comes first. You would then know if people just check all the way down one line, if they really read the questions and responded, or if they just filled in bubbles. It also means that you may have to throw out a lot of responses if you realize they weren't really paying attention. Also, if you do something like that, you'd want to say, please read each question carefully. The answers are not necessarily in the order that you might anticipate, just to give them a heads up that they're going to be a little bit more thoughtful, need to be more thoughtful in their answering. Most standardized tests that are the most valid actually use this mixing of the options technique in order to test the validity and to bolster that validity. Some questions in our surveys or interviews can influence the responses of others. If you believe a question may affect how participants will respond to another question, ask the potentially affected question first, and you can pilot these to be sure. So if you know that one question may impact how someone may feel about another question, change that order. And you may not even think of it until you pilot it. Pilot it with people you know. There's nothing wrong with piloting it with people even that are experts in your field, though it's good to get some who are not. Pilot it and then ask them, how'd you feel about this? Were any of these questions confusing? How did you respond? Would you do anything differently? That's the purpose in a pilot. If you want to know what people prefer or tend towards, do not give them a neutral option. I almost never give a neutral option because I usually want to know in which direction are they leaning, even if it's slightly. People will tend towards the mean and away from the extremes. In fact, there's a social psychology theory that describes tendency toward the means. It's one of the top 8 theories in the field of social psychology. And we will always see ourselves and report more centric than in fact we really are as humans. That doesn't mean that every single human always does that, but on average, we will find a tendency towards the means when we're reporting on things. Your results will likely become more centric than reality. If you offer a midpoint or neutral option, your results will be even more centric or more neutral. And if you really want to know where people lean or prefer, you just need to get rid of that midpoint. Example, I believe that if I were to ask this question of faculty, I believe that all course content in college and university courses should be fully accessible before offered to students. And I give them strongly agree, unsure, disagree, and strongly disagree. I've totally given so many faculty a way out of really committing to an answer. Some of them are thinking, well, I think I'm supposed to agree, but it seems like a lot to ask, so I don't know. If I say I disagree, I sound like a real jerk because I kind of think I'm supposed to agree. But if I say I agree, maybe I need to hold myself to that standard. These are the things that people are thinking. I'll just click unsure and at least I haven't gotten it wrong or given a negative perception of myself. Now, we all know most of these things are done anonymously, but still people worry about the perception that they're giving of themselves and don't even want to absorb that negative perception themselves. In this case, there's no way I would ever give the unsure option. Protocol as applied to surveys. When you choose to utilize surveys or questionnaires, you must decide how you will distribute them. Phone, mail, email, in groups, one-on-one. There are pros and cons to survey methods. Research methods, your research methods knowledge base on survey methods gives you some pros and cons to phone, email, mail, in groups, and one-on-one. Check that out in the RMKB site under research methods and the survey types, and you will find a chart there that describes the pros and cons and the limitations to any of these options to help you decide which you should choose. And as you write up the limitations of your instruments and your protocol, you will have your answers right there from that source, and you can cite that. Also, you need to determine what you can do and then note the limitations. There may be a perfect option, one that you think is preferred, but you realize you just can't do it. It's not possible to do it face-to-face or one-on-one, so you have to opt for something else because of your own resources. Describe the protocol for how you will do something in such a way that a stranger could follow. This will be an appendix for each instrument. Your instruments are your data collection tools. Flour, yeast, water, eggs, sugar, and baking soda for your pizza crust recipe. The protocol a researcher will follow is the part of the recipe that ensures that you will in fact make pizza crust. Without the protocol, one might put all ingredients in a cake pan, eyeballing the measurements and estimating on amounts, and bake on 275 for 6 hours. Hopefully you all realize that's not going to produce pizza crust. I'm not sure if it would produce anything edible at all. Your proposals will have at least one appendix that is an instrument and one appendix that is your protocol for that instrument. In rare occasions, if it's exploratory and qualitative, you may only have protocol, but usually we know some of the questions we're asking, and again, we've all been encouraged to do demographic data. This is where it all starts to take shape, your research in your instruments. It starts to get real, and it really can.